September 1944. Arracourt, France. A small town in Lorraine that most people had never heard of was about to become the site of the greatest American tank victory of World War II. German Panzer commanders, veterans of the Eastern Front who had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, were confident as they prepared to attack American positions. They had faced American Shermans before and knew how to kill them. They expected another easy victory. What they didn't expect was the M18 Hellcat. German tankers who first encountered this vehicle in combat called it a toy tank because it looked impossibly light and fragile compared to their massive Panthers and Tigers. It had thin armor that could barely stop machine gun fire. It weighed only 18 tons, less than half the weight of a Panther. It looked like something that would be destroyed in the first minutes of combat. The Germans laughed when they saw it. Then the Hellcats started shooting. Over the next 10 days, American tank destroyer battalions, equipped with M18 Hellcats, would destroy 83 German tanks at Arracourt, while losing fewer than 30 of their own vehicles. It was a kill ratio that shocked both sides and proved that the American tank destroyer concept, which many critics had dismissed as flawed, could work devastatingly well when employed correctly. The Germans stopped laughing. They started dying. This is the story of the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked armored vehicle of World War II. This is the story of how American designers chose speed and firepower over armor, and created a vehicle that German tankers learned to fear. And this is the story of Arracourt, where the toy tank proved it could dance with Panthers and Tigers and leave them burning across the French countryside. To understand what made the M18 Hellcat so effective, you need to understand the American tank destroyer doctrine that created it. In the early years of World War II, American military planners became convinced that tanks should not fight other tanks. Tanks, they believed, should support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. Fighting enemy tanks would be the job of specialized tank destroyers. Fast, hard-hitting vehicles that could rush to threatened sectors, ambush enemy armor, and withdraw before the enemy could respond. This doctrine was controversial. Many officers, particularly those who had studied German blitzkrieg tactics, argued that tanks needed to be able to fight other tanks. But the tank destroyer advocates won the debate, and the U.S. Army began developing specialized vehicles for the tank destroyer role. The M18 Hellcat was the ultimate expression of this concept. A vehicle designed from the ground up to kill tanks and nothing else. The design specifications for the M18 were radical. It had to be fast, incredibly fast, faster than any tank on the battlefield. It had to have a powerful gun capable of destroying any enemy armor at long range. And it had to be light enough to be produced quickly and transported easily. Armor protection was deliberately sacrificed to achieve these goals. The designers reasoned that the M18 wouldn't need heavy armor because it would never be hit. It would see the enemy first, shoot first, and be gone before the enemy could return fire. The result was extraordinary. The M18 Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour on roads, making it the fastest tracked armored vehicle in World War II. Its power-to-weight ratio was exceptional, giving it incredible acceleration and mobility across rough terrain. It mounted a 76mm M1A1 gun, the same weapon that was being installed in late-model Sherman tanks, capable of penetrating the armor of any German tank from the side or rear, and even the frontal armor of most German vehicles at reasonable ranges. But the Hellcat's armor was almost non-existent by tank standards. The front armor was only 1 inch thick. The sides and rear were even thinner, barely half an inch in some places. This armor could stop rifle bullets and shell fragments, but nothing more. A hit from any German tank gun would penetrate effortlessly. A hit from an 88mm gun would probably pass completely through the vehicle, in one side and out the other. The M18's crew knew that their survival depended on not being hit at all. The Hellcat had an open-topped turret, which gave the crew excellent visibility, but left them exposed to artillery fragments and small arms fire. This was another controversial design choice. An open turret was lighter and allowed better observation, but it meant the crew was vulnerable to anything falling from above. In practice, crews learned to cover the open turret with a tarp when not in combat, and the excellent visibility proved more valuable than the protection a closed turret would have provided. The vehicle's crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. The commander and gunner worked together to acquire targets and direct fire. The loader fed 76mm shells into the breech as fast as possible. The driver and assistant driver had perhaps the most important job: keeping the Hellcat moving, positioning it for shots, and getting it out of danger before enemy return fire could arrive. In the M18, the driver was as important as the gunner. Production of the M18 began in mid-1943, and by D-Day in June 1944, several tank destroyer battalions had been equipped with the vehicle. The first M18s arrived in Europe in July 1944 and immediately entered combat. Initial results were mixed. Some crews loved the speed and firepower. Others felt dangerously exposed in the lightly armored vehicle and wished they were in something more substantial. But no one could deny that the Hellcat could move like nothing else on the battlefield. By September 1944, the M18 had been in combat for 2 months and had established a solid record. Crews were learning how to use the vehicle's speed and firepower to maximum advantage. They were developing tactics: shoot and scoot, hit and run, ambush and withdraw. The Hellcat was proving that the tank destroyer doctrine could work. But it hadn't yet faced a major test against concentrated German armor. That test was about to come at a small French town called Arracourt. By September 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had raced across France faster than anyone thought possible. The breakout from Normandy had been spectacular. Paris had been liberated. American forces were approaching the German border. But Patton's supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. His tanks were running out of fuel. His advance had to pause while logistics caught up. And that pause gave the Germans an opportunity. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, ordered a counterattack against Patton's exposed forces in Lorraine. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, was to strike at the town of Arracourt and drive the Americans back. It was an ambitious plan. Von Manteuffel had approximately 250 tanks under his command, including Panthers from the 113th Panzer Brigade and a mix of Panzer IV tanks and assault guns. It was a powerful force, commanded by experienced officers, manned by veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front. The Americans defending Arracourt included elements of the 4th Armored Division and 2 tank destroyer battalions: the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 609th Tank Destroyer Battalion, both equipped with M18 Hellcats. In total, the Americans had approximately 150 tanks and tank destroyers in the sector. They were outnumbered, and many of their vehicles were Shermans with the older 75mm gun that struggled against German heavy armor. But they had advantages the Germans didn't know about. The terrain around Arracourt favored the defenders. Rolling hills provided excellent observation positions. Small patches of woods offered concealment. Most importantly, there were numerous hull-down positions where American tank destroyers could position themselves with only their turrets exposed, making them almost impossible to spot until they opened fire. The American commanders, studying the terrain, realized they could turn Arracourt into a shooting gallery if they positioned their forces correctly. The M18 Hellcat crews were given specific instructions. They would not charge into combat like traditional tanks. Instead, they would set up in carefully chosen ambush positions with good fields of fire and easy escape routes. They would wait for the Germans to advance into range. They would shoot and keep shooting until the position became dangerous. Then they would withdraw rapidly to alternate positions and repeat the process. It was classic tank destroyer doctrine, and the M18's speed would make it possible to execute perfectly. The Battle of Arracourt began on September 19th when German forces launched their attack. The 113th Panzer Brigade, equipped with 43 brand-new Panther tanks, led the assault. The Panther was one of the finest tanks of World War II, heavily armored, mounting a powerful 75mm gun, fast for its size. The German commanders were confident. They had Panthers. The Americans had Shermans and some strange light vehicles. This would be over quickly. The Germans advanced across open ground toward American positions. At ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, the M18 Hellcats opened fire. The 76mm guns roared, and Panthers began exploding. The German tankers were shocked. They had expected to face Shermans with weak 75mm guns. Instead, they were being hit by weapons that could penetrate Panther armor. And they couldn't see where the fire was coming from. The M18s were hull down in prepared positions, nearly invisible, firing from concealment. The Germans tried to return fire, but it was like shooting at ghosts. Every time they identified an M18 position and brought guns to bear, the American vehicle would reverse down the slope, move laterally under cover, and pop up somewhere else. The Hellcat's speed made this shoot-and-scoot tactic devastatingly effective. The German tanks, heavier and slower, couldn't keep up. They would spot an M18, turn their turrets to engage, and find the target had vanished. Then fire would come from a different direction. By the end of the first day, the German 113th Panzer Brigade had been destroyed. Of the 43 Panthers that began the attack, only 7 survived to retreat. The rest were smoking wrecks scattered across the fields around Arracourt. German casualties were catastrophic. American losses were minimal. The Germans had walked into a perfectly executed ambush, and the M18 Hellcats had cut them to pieces. It was one of the most one-sided engagements of the entire war. But the battle wasn't over. Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, ordered continued attacks. More German tanks were thrown into the meat grinder at Arracourt. The 5th Panzer Army attacked again on September 20th, 21st, 22nd, and beyond. Each attack followed the same pattern. German tanks would advance. American M18s would engage from prepared positions. German tanks would burn. The Americans would suffer some losses, but the exchange ratio remained heavily in their favor. The numbers from Arracourt tell a story of complete American dominance. Over 10 days of fighting from September 19th to 29th, American forces destroyed 83 German tanks and assault guns. The M18 Hellcats accounted for a disproportionate number of these kills, despite being only part of the American force. Some individual Hellcat crews claimed 5 or more tank kills during the battle. The exchange ratio was approximately 3-to-1 in favor of the Americans, an extraordinary result against experienced German tankers and quality equipment. But the numbers don't tell the full story. What made Arracourt so significant wasn't just the kill ratio. It was the proof that American tank destroyer doctrine could work exactly as designed when conditions were right. The M18 Hellcats had done exactly what they were supposed to do. Move quickly to threatened areas, engage enemy armor from advantageous positions, and withdraw before they could be destroyed. The toy tank had validated an entire concept of armored warfare. Individual actions during the battle became legendary in tank destroyer circles. One M18 commander, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, positioned his vehicle on a hill overlooking a valley where German tanks were advancing. Over the course of several hours, his crew methodically engaged and destroyed 6 German tanks. Each time they fired, they would reverse behind the crest of the hill, move laterally, and emerge at a slightly different position. The Germans knew there was a tank destroyer on that hill, but they couldn't pin it down. Every time they thought they had the range, the M18 would appear somewhere else and shoot again. Another M18 crew found themselves facing a Tiger I heavy tank, one of the most feared vehicles in the German arsenal. The Tiger's frontal armor was nearly impervious to the 76mm gun at normal combat ranges. But the Hellcat crew didn't engage frontally. They used their superior speed to maneuver around the Tiger, getting a side shot at less than 500 yards. The 76mm armor-piercing round penetrated the Tiger's side armor, and the massive tank erupted in flames. It was a textbook example of how the M18 was meant to fight. Use mobility to negate the enemy's armor advantage and strike from the flank. The German perspective on the battle was one of growing frustration and confusion. Reports from German tank commanders described being engaged by American vehicles that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. They would advance, take fire, try to respond, and find the enemy gone. Then they would take fire from a different direction. The German tankers, trained to fight the set-piece armor battles of the Eastern Front where tanks slugged it out at medium range, didn't know how to counter this hit-and-run tactic. German intelligence reports from the period show they were struggling to understand what was happening. Initial reports described the American vehicles as light tanks of unknown type. Then they were identified as tank destroyers. But the reports expressed confusion about how such lightly armored vehicles could survive against German guns. The answer, which the Germans eventually figured out, was that the M18s weren't surviving hits. They were avoiding being hit in the first place. By the time German guns were aimed at an M18 position, the vehicle was already gone. The Battle of Arracourt also demonstrated the importance of training and crew quality. The American tank destroyer crews at Arracourt were well trained and knew their equipment intimately. They understood the M18's capabilities and limitations. They knew exactly how fast they could move, how quickly they could aim and fire, how far they could shoot accurately. This familiarity allowed them to execute complex maneuvers under fire without hesitation. They trusted their vehicles, and that trust was rewarded. The 76mm M1A1 gun proved itself at Arracourt. While not as powerful as the German 88mm or the Russian 85mm guns, the 76 was accurate, reliable, and powerful enough to penetrate German armor at the ranges where most engagements occurred. Using armor-piercing rounds, the M18 could reliably penetrate the side and rear armor of any German tank. Even Panthers, with their excellent frontal armor, were vulnerable from the side. And the M18's mobility made side shots possible. The terrain at Arracourt had been perfect for tank destroyer operations. But the M18 crews had made the most of it. They had identified the best firing positions before the battle started. They had planned their withdrawal routes. They had pre-positioned ammunition at alternate firing points so they could keep shooting even as they displaced. This level of preparation, combined with the vehicle's capabilities, created a killing system that the Germans couldn't counter. By late September, the German attacks at Arracourt had exhausted themselves. The 5th Panzer Army had lost over 260 armored vehicles in the offensive, with the majority destroyed in the fighting around Arracourt. German commanders reported that their forces were no longer combat effective and recommended defensive operations. Hitler's counteroffensive had failed completely. The Americans held Arracourt and would continue their advance toward Germany. The Panthers and Tigers had been defeated by toy tanks that were supposed to be easy targets. The Battle of Arracourt was the high watermark for American tank destroyer doctrine. It proved that under the right conditions, with proper employment and adequate training, tank destroyers could devastate enemy armor while suffering acceptable losses themselves. The M18 Hellcat, which had been criticized by some as too lightly armored to survive modern combat, had demonstrated that speed and firepower could compensate for lack of protection when the vehicle was used correctly. After Arracourt, the reputation of the M18 Hellcat soared. Tank destroyer battalions that had been skeptical of the vehicle became believers. Crews who had initially felt vulnerable in the lightly armored Hellcat came to appreciate its mobility and hitting power. Word spread through Third Army about what had happened at Arracourt, and M18s began to be employed more aggressively. The toy tank had earned respect. The Germans, for their part, learned to be much more cautious when tank destroyers were in the area. Intelligence briefings warned German tank commanders about the M18's speed and gunpowder. Reports described the shoot and scoot tactics and recommended that Hellcats be engaged with artillery or infantry rather than attempting tank versus tank combat. The psychological impact of Arracourt affected German tactical decisions for the rest of the war. But Arracourt also exposed the limitations of tank destroyer doctrine. The battle had been fought under nearly ideal conditions: good terrain for defense, adequate preparation time, and a predictable German attack. In other situations, particularly in urban combat or when tank destroyers were forced to operate offensively, the M18's thin armor became a severe liability. Tank destroyer units that tried to advance with tanks in street fighting suffered heavy casualties. The Hellcat was superb at what it was designed to do, but it couldn't do everything. Throughout the rest of 1944 and into 1945, M18 Hellcats continued to serve with distinction. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, where their mobility proved valuable in responding to German breakthroughs. They supported the crossing of the Rhine. They raced across Germany in the final months of the war. Total production reached over 2,500 vehicles, making the M18 one of the most numerous American tank destroyers. The M18's combat record was impressive by any measure. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats achieved the highest kill ratios of any American armored unit. One battalion, the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, claimed over 300 German tanks destroyed while losing only 17 M18s. These numbers, even accounting for the inevitable overclaiming in combat, demonstrate the vehicle's effectiveness when properly employed. Individual M18s achieved legendary status. One vehicle, nicknamed Assassin, was credited with over 20 tank kills during its service. Another, Hell on Wheels, survived the entire campaign from France to Germany without suffering a single penetrating hit, despite being engaged numerous times. These vehicles became symbols of American ingenuity and fighting spirit, proving that clever design could overcome raw armor thickness. After World War II, the tank destroyer concept fell out of favor. The Army concluded that tanks needed to be able to fight other tanks and that specialized tank destroyers were unnecessary. The M18 Hellcat was retired from American service, though many were provided to Allied nations. Some served for decades in foreign armies, a testament to the basic soundness of the design. Today, several M18s survive in museums, silent reminders of a controversial doctrine that, for one shining moment at Arracourt, worked exactly as intended. The men who crewed the M18 Hellcats never forgot their experience. Veterans of Arracourt would later describe the feeling of power that came from sitting in the fastest armored vehicle on the battlefield, with a gun that could kill any enemy tank. They remembered the thrill of speed, the satisfaction of a perfect shot, and the relief of escaping before enemy return fire arrived. They knew they had been vulnerable, but they also knew they had been deadly. The legacy of the M18 Hellcat extends beyond its combat record. It represents a particular American approach to warfare, accepting risk in exchange for mobility and firepower, trusting in crew skill and technological advantage rather than heavy armor, believing that the best defense is a devastating offense. These principles would influence American armored vehicle design for decades. The M18 was a tank destroyer, but it was also a statement about how Americans thought war should be fought. The Germans stopped laughing at the toy tank after Arracourt. They had learned, at terrible cost, that the M18 Hellcat was no toy. It was a precision instrument of destruction, designed to kill tanks and incredibly good at its job. In the hands of a skilled crew, with proper tactics and favorable terrain, the Hellcat was one of the most dangerous vehicles on the battlefield. The 83 German tanks destroyed at Arracourt were proof of that. And the German tankers who survived encounters with Hellcats carried a healthy respect for the little American tank destroyer that could move like the wind and hit like a sledgehammer. Today, when military historians discuss the greatest American armored vehicles of World War II, the M18 Hellcat deserves to be on the list. Not because it was the most powerful or the best protected, but because it perfectly fulfilled its intended role. It was designed to hunt and kill enemy tanks, and at Arracourt in September 1944, it did exactly that with devastating efficiency. The Battle of Arracourt was the M18's finest moment, the vindication of everything the designers had hoped to achieve. The toy tank had proven itself in the most demanding test possible, combat against the best armor Germany could field, and it had won decisively.